Hi, you're watching Strangers in Space, and for the next 20 minutes, we're going to be doing a bit more Doctor Who What Ifery, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Hi, I'm Dylan.
And I'm John.
So this is, if you are listening, the second half of the episode, and if you're watching, this one's out by itself on YouTube. What we've been doing, or what I've been doing, is because we're only recording short episodes of these, I've been sticking two together to make a longer, more substantial episode. And so this is the team for the second half: me, Matt, John, Dylan. And so the other thing is, we're going to run out of Nexus points if we just continue to do the big moments. So far with these, the obvious things that have been making themselves felt is moments when showrunners change, moments when doctors change, moments when doctors could have changed, those sorts of things where big stuff changes that might have an impression for the entire rest of the life of the series. But we're not going to find too many of those, so I'm going to introduce something else with this. So I'm going to start with something else now. And the thing I'm going to start with is a story nexus point rather than a series nexus point. So I'll come back to it. But I also want to say at this point, if people want to write in and make suggestions for story nexus points along the lines of what I'm about to outline here, feel free to do so. Find any of us on social media and they'll get it back to me, or find any of the Strangers in Space social media accounts and those will come straight to me. And we've started to advertise those. I've started to put those in the show notes anyway. I mean, I always just assumed people would find us, but it was pointed out by BD568 and Squirty Slartfast on Apple reviews that it wasn't necessarily as easy to find us as I thought. So I've started to do that. Also, I should mention that David Moss has already written in with suggestions. He wrote in with suggestions for the bigger Nexus points. And of course, of the suggestions, he's wrote two suggestions. One we'd already covered and another one we were just about to. I've put that back till the next time because I figure spread those out a bit. But here's the story Nexus point then. And this goes back to a conversation we were having the other week, and that's why it popped into my head. So I thought, seeing as it's popped into my head, why not use it for this as an example of how this goes forward? So Matt, you should probably want to put your fingers in your ears at this point, because I'm about to offend you, because I'm about to commit heresy. So here's the question. We talked about Inferno. And my complaint about Inferno was basically that you go to the alternative planet Earth, and basically, apart from the Brigadier, everybody's pretty much exactly the same as they are in the normal universe. Here's what I'm suggesting. Is there a way to do that story where you don't fundamentally change the parts of the story that you enjoy, but you do something else that either improves it or at least changes it enough that it feels significantly more different? And the thing that I was going to suggest is this, but I mean, you can come up with your own suggestions, or you can just, put two fingers up and tell me to naff off. What if, when the Doctor gets to the alternative planet Earth, instead of everybody behaving pretty much exactly the same as they had in our universe, this being the guest cast I'm talking about rather than the regulars, what if Stahlman in the alternative universe wants to stop the project because he realizes disaster is imminent? What if Greg Sutton has been put in as a government mole to make him continue, forcing him to continue at the hands of Sir Keith Gold, who's controlling him? So Sir Keith Gold is working for the government, insisting that the project goes ahead. Greg Sutton's his man on the inside, a double agent who Stahlman doesn't realize is working for Sir Keith Gold, who's making the project go ahead. Stahlman's trying to stop it. Everybody else is insisting he goes ahead. And of course, Dr. Petra Williams. Well, I knew Matt wouldn't like it. I think it makes more sense.
I think it makes sense if it wasn't Inferno. So there's I can see your point, but I think the fact that it's the regulars that are flipped has quite a kind of an impact, and I think that's the hook. And I think if you then change, there has to be a sort of a parallel as well as a difference. And I think if you change the other supporting cast too much, then suddenly you just get two separate stories. You lose that kind of mirroring. I think you do. I think you lose the mirroring, and I think it probably diminishes the impact of the regular cast being complete bastards, and Liz Shaw being kind of on the fence slightly between being nasty and nice.
And also because you would have the characters acting completely differently. When it comes to the final episode, the Doctor would be barking entirely up the wrong tree, so you'd end Inferno Part 7 on the apocalypse of our Earth.
What a way
Which
to
would be a
finish,
fun
though.
way to end the season.
I know, because he goes there knowing that Starman's determined, so he knows that in the alternative universe, I don't know, I just think you could have more fun with the idea of Starman being in the alternative universe, the one who's actually trying to save the project, and you'd give Olaf Pooley something to do.
You'd need to find a way to make it reflect on our universe, though, because the fact that the Doctor gets the
But no,
means of
they're
the
still
is the
drilling,
point
John.
of that whole thing.
Yeah, no, they're still drilling. That's the whole point. It's just that in the alternative version, it's Sir Keith Gold he needs to talk down and fails, whereas in our version, he comes back and it's Starman. But in the alternative version, because Starman's, on the side of the angels, the Doctor learns stuff about Starman that he can use when he gets back to our universe.
I mean,
So, I don't know.
It kind of makes more sense of the mirror universe that way, because Starman is an independent thinker. He's a kind of a renegade in this fascist world. The government's the enemy. Keith Gold is an agent of the government, presumably. Sutton is an agent of the government. So that should be the way that it works. That would be the obvious thing to have in the parallel universe. But,
and of course,
as I said, I think to make the mirroring work, you need certain numbers of character similarities, and then the regular characters, their flipping has much more of an impact that way.
Of course, the other thing you've got to remember is if this had been the version that they'd told, you would never have seen the version that we've got now to compare it with. So you'd never have seen the crap version. You'd only have the good version.
I don't think your idea would have ruined Inferno.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
I don't think it would have diminished it.
I do.
But I think your view that Inferno needs improving somehow is probably a minority view.
I don't care.
Put
I'm
it
asking the
politely.
questions.
I don't think Inferno needs improving, but I do actually think JR's version is better. I'm sold.
Oh,
So there we go. Don Hatton was a hack. Well, it was Don Hatton, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, he wrote The Mind of Evil.
Have we given him?
No
Nick
one's ever
Briggs-
watched that.
Have we given him Nick Briggs' phone number here for a remake?
Look, let's get on to a more substantial question. So we're back to sort of series nexus points now. So I'm going to, at the end of the War Games, the Doctor is about to be changed, and we know not how or into what the Doctor is going to be changed. And we only learn in the off season that it's John Pertwee who's replacing him. And then it comes back and we're all expecting John Pertwee. But what if the BBC hadn't done that? What if the BBC hadn't said who the Doctor was going to be? What if Spearhead from Space starts with the TARDIS landing in the forest, the door to the TARDIS opening, and a woman stepping out and falling to the ground? And what if the series, what if Barry Letts and, no, it's not pre-Barry Letts, isn't it? What if Derek Sherwin doesn't make it clear that the person who falls out of the TARDIS really is the Doctor? What if we really are on the side of the Brigadier with no idea? What if they give us the first woman Doctor in 1970, but they don't tell us it's the Doctor? We have to learn that for ourselves across the first 4 episodes in the same way as the other characters do. What I'm asking is, and don't forget this would have been script edited, show run by Terrance Dicks, so it wouldn't quite have been the Doctor as a woman as we might expect it in this day and age. But what I'm really asking is, if they'd have done that, if they'd have kept the identity of the new Doctor as a surprise and given us maybe the first woman Doctor, but allowed us to form our own opinions and get used to that person across the course of the first story or even the first couple of stories, could that have worked? Would Doctor Who have been significantly altered? Would it have been significantly more or less popular? Would people have tuned in out of the intrigue of not knowing whether this person was the Doctor?
I don't think the gender flip is such a big deal, weirdly, back then, because there hasn't really been as much precedent. So I think you could get away with it. Truthfully, it probably would have been basically Liz Shaw, but alien, because that's probably about as far as Terrance Dicks can go. But I'd just be very disappointed that it wasn't that pencil drawing of a fat guy from the War Games, which I've always wanted to see.
I think Dylan's right. Yeah, Welsh Dylan is right. I actually think
Tom Rees.
I actually think the surprise bit is less likely than the female. I think the female Doctor is unlikely. Don't get me wrong, because this is the sort of pretty much the 1960s. People are making decisions, and it hasn't quite got that far. I think this is barely any better, really. Is the surprise bit? I think is less likely because I think the BBC lived at that time on promotion and anticipation of a particular actor. They'd like to put the photograph of the actor on the opening title sequences, and I think at this point the series was in jeopardy enough, to not have any surprises. Just carry on as it should be. Don't do anything shocking.
But that's kind of my point. You could have had
a Radio Times code with like "Who is the Doctor" or something. That would be a
I think it would be great. But I've always thought that a surprise. One thing Doctor Who's never managed to do is a surprise regeneration and a surprise new Doctor. The identity of a new Doctor has been a surprise, and I think I can see why, and I think it would be a really terrible marketing decision. But in terms of I think your fan brain would be. I think
you're doing down David Tennant's 11th Doctor here.
No, I tell you what, you're not necessarily taking into account is in the 21st century run of Doctor Who, the only episodes that have broken 13 million or 12 million, no, I can't remember exactly, but the two highest rated episodes of the entire 21st century run are Voyage of the Damned, which is the Kylie effect, and then out of all the other episodes, Day of the Doctor, The End of Time, Journey's End, with its sort of regenerating David Tennant climax, out of all those stories, the one with the second highest viewing figures, unless I'm completely mistaken, but I'm fairly sure of this, is the next Doctor, because everybody tuned in because they didn't know if they were getting a surprise regeneration.
And it's Christmas.
Yeah,
I think there's a point on the viewing figures around the time they were split between the BBC and the BBC HD channel, so I think The End of Time might get there. It was kind of overall the number one watch.
You're splitting hairs over the fact that the next Doctor got significantly more viewers than it would have otherwise.
Yeah, it's a nice tarty title, isn't it?
And I'm not suggesting that a new season with a new Doctor, an unknown new Doctor, wouldn't be a ratings winner. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do it, but they wouldn't do it because there's cheap and easy, presumably, publicity with introducing the new Doctor and building up to the new Doctor and getting the new Doctor on Instagram and various other things and building up that presence.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm just what ifing about.
I like it. Yeah.
You can kind of say Joe Martin was a surprise because no one expected that, did they?
But that was from the past, like the War Doctor was. It wasn't a regeneration, was it? Because
it's a kind of a artificial, isn't it?
It's as close as we're going to get.
Chameleon arch, yeah.
And if Joe Martin had done a whole season or a series of stories, then that would have been impressive.
But Big Finish.
Did somebody bring up Joe Martin while Matt was in the room?
I think the one other point you could do a surprise Doctor in the show's history, if I'm not mistaken, is probably Day of the Doctor when you get that Capaldi, because I don't think he'd started shooting or shot his.
No.
So I think that's the only other time you could have done it. But I mean, at the time they were announcing Peter Capaldi as Doctor Who, so it was a big deal. So of course they wanted fanfare, and the anniversary episode's going to get the fanfare anyway.
Yeah, they spaffed the surprise all over BBC One on a Saturday night with an entire show dedicated to it.
Which what they should have done though, because the eyebrows don't you can't be if you don't know that that's Peter Capaldi. Those eyes, that shot of those eyes, isn't necessarily going to tell you entirely for sure that that's him. They could have done that and then had the program to introduce who the Doctor's going to be, more or less immediately afterwards. Not necessarily right after the program, but maybe the next day or something. Meaning that for 24 hours, you've got a frenzy of speculation. Was that Peter Capaldi? Was it somebody else who looks like him? For 24 hours, that could have been crazy, like the David Tennant thing in 2008 with Journey's End and the false regeneration.
I mean, getting back to the original premise, who would you cast as a female Doctor in 1970?
Well, that's true, because back in 1970, parts for women in television.
Women didn't exist. There were no women.
I would have loved to have seen a male assistant being told to make a cup of tea. That would have been great.
Margaret Rutherford.
Yeah. But you know, I mean,
so
Jean
John
Marsh,
again, then.
Somebody like Jean Marsh, maybe.
Ooh,
I think.
Nice.
Yeah, Jean Marsh, I think, could have made a great Doctor, actually, given
Get
what we
Beryl
see
Reid
of
in.
They could have done a surprise casting with 10th Planet. That's something they could have done, because actually announcing Patrick Troughton as the replacement in the press was probably quite risky, because you're sort of saying
It wasn't really
the only
announced,
person, the only
if I
doctor
was-
you,
if I'm mistaken.
the only doctor you know is leaving, and I'm sure I've seen a newspaper article saying
Yeah, but it's
Patrick
like
Troughton is the new Doctor Who.
It's minor. It's like
it's a
Yeah, yeah,
column.
5,
Yeah.
6.
Yeah, and I'm imagining that's, they would have kept fairly quiet about that, because the show's stability relies on the central character, and changing the identity isn't a selling point at that point. It's a kind of, is this going to work? Are we going to get away with it?
Yeah,
So
it's
if
the
they
thing we've
did it,
had to do. Yeah.
if they did it as a surprise, it wouldn't have made much difference.
Yeah, it'd be a really good, because William Hart's the only man in England who can take over from me.
Yeah.
But several women might be able to.
Yeah.
And it would have really played in nicely to that kind of uncertainty in Power of the Daleks that Ben and Polly have got.
Oh, that's the
same guy. That would have been great.
That's the big difference, though, isn't it? If they'd have cast a woman as the third Doctor, William Hartnell wouldn't have turned up for the 3 Doctors. Okay, I've got another question. Since we're only on 17 minutes, let's do another question. Staying with the same area and the same type of thing. And the question is simply this: what if Barry Letts had decided that keeping the Doctor on Earth was a terrific idea? And so you wouldn't have had things like Colony in Space and Curse of Peladon, where the Doctor gets... Well, you wouldn't have had those stories where the Doctor gets sent off as missions. But I guess what I'm asking is, they reinvented Doctor Who for the 1970s as basically an ITC serial with aliens coming to Earth. And that's basically what it looked like for about 5 years, because even when John Pertwee got his keys to the TARDIS back, he was only going off and having off-world adventures the same amount of times as he was going on off-world adventures for the Time Lords when he didn't have the keys to the TARDIS. So it didn't really make much difference until about 1976 or 77, in fact. But what I'm saying is, if that had been a deliberate choice, would that have made a massive amount of difference? And actually, moving into the late 70s and 80s, would a more earthbound Doctor Who be a programme that might have kept its sort of viewers and popularity better after the 20th anniversary? If Doctor Who had continued for the rest of its life as an earthbound series, with occasional jaunts into history and occasional trips off-world, but, by and large, a mostly earthbound series, as it was for large parts of that anyway, would that not have kept the viewers a bit more engaged with it, maybe, as time went on?
I think it's the time travel, the going into the past, which is the key, because going off into space, you can find any ways of doing that, or bringing space to Earth. But traveling in time, there's only so many times you can do it without the TARDIS before it starts looking a little unlikely. And I think that is a characteristic of Doctor Who. I think Doctor Who will snap into that position.
But having said that, Doctor Who didn't go back into the past an awful lot between 1970 and 1989. I mean, when you get to Curse of Fenric and that's the only time it starts doing it in sort of successive stories. In the 1970s, Barry Letts, the only time they go back into the past is the Time Monster and the Time Warrior. I think I'm struggling to think of any others.
Theoretically, Carnival of Monsters has artificial scenes there.
I suppose you could have the Doctor tinkering with the TARDIS and it gets the ability to travel in time back, but not in space at some point.
Yeah.
You can always find a fix for anything, can't you?
I think it obviously becomes a very different show, but I think perhaps that thing of the embarrassment of perhaps parts of how the series looked in the Williams era leading to the 80s, where it starts to become this thing of fun because it does look like this hokey sci-fi show. I'm sure it'd still have its fair share of hokey things, but when you're not dealing with the sort of set design of alien worlds and making merkers and things like that, perhaps there is a world where it's more fondly remembered in, say, the 80s than it was for a long time in sort of public consciousness. So I do think that, and Andrew Cartmel realized eventually that the best thing to do was to sort of you go a bit into history, period stuff, or modern day Earth. So I don't think it's impossible, but it would require some tampering, but I think it could have been beneficial.
It's an interesting contrast because obviously late 70s, the sci-fi, you have Star Wars and alien sci-fi has a very different look to it suddenly. So Doctor Who is an effective contrast to that. It's not kind of Michael Gray saying we're cancelling this because you can't do Star Wars on a BBC budget. So it might well have prolonged the show past the hiatus. So you might have avoided all those little bumps in the road in the 80s, maybe, I'd say.
I think ultimately would have had to have snapped back into, because the TARDIS is effectively like a machine for developing new stories.
Was it a door between stories, Paul?
And there's the old adage that there's only three Earthbound stories you can write. I don't think that's entirely true, because then Barry Letts and Roger Slocum write 3 Earthbound stories which are actually quite good. So they do the Demons, they do the Green Death, they do Planet of Spiders, and they're all different versions of Earthbound stories just to prove that the concept could work. But at some point you're going to have a writer or a producer looking at the series and thinking, wouldn't it be great if we had the TARDIS just to give us the option of going to a quarry somewhere and doing an alien planet?
Yeah, I don't think it lasts beyond any change of producer, because they want their own stamp on the series. And the most obvious thing you can do for that is go, I'm changing it to we're going back to outer space.
You say that, but if they have been used to 5, 6, 7 years of the sort of series being set on Earth, a new incoming producer doesn't necessarily think, oh, let's go back to space. That wouldn't be at the forefront of their thoughts. And the thing is, you could still do the occasion.
If you go back to that, Star Wars comes in, and that suddenly becomes the expectation on science fiction. Much as an Earth series might have weathered it, I think they look at that and they go, "We want a bit of that," because Doctor Who isn't made in isolation.
I know, but it only becomes the expectation of a certain kind of sort of science fiction. And I think if Doctor Who had been Earthbound, it would have mutated by this point, so that it no longer resembled that kind of science fiction. And you'd have an occasional story, maybe once a year on average. So some years you wouldn't have one, some years you might have 2, where he goes off into space. But I think the series itself would have evolved anyway if they'd have stayed on Earth much longer than they did. And let's be honest,
how many of those alien world stories, though, can you not tell in an Earthbound format? That's a question. How many are based on these strange worlds, and how many are some kind of humans you could tell?
And I think that's my point about time travel. I think time travel is more of a characteristic of the series than space travel, because time travel is harder to. I mean, you have the time monster does things with time, which is quite interesting. The Demons kind of does time travel, but if you read my Black Archive on the Demons, it kind of does time travel without time travel actually happening. But at some point you run out of those things, because you can leave the Earth. You can have Ambassadors of Death, where the Doctor goes up in a rocket ship, or as they called them in the 1950s. But
survival, at the other end of the spectrum, survival goes to an alien planet without the TARDIS.
Yeah, there's always ways of traveling in space without the TARDIS. I think there's limited ways of traveling in time without the TARDIS before it starts feeling a bit weird. Which is not to say there isn't time travel without the TARDIS, but you know, the more things like time bracelets and
as I say, you could get the
time
TARDIS,
shifting.
part functioning TARDIS that travels in time but never leaves the Earth.
I'm
That
reminded of Phil Collinson was interviewed in DWM years ago when, you know, after like series 1 or 2, and they said, what would you do if Doctor Who's budget was halved? And he said, it would double the amount of episodes made, but it'd all be Earth based. So
well, the first season is essentially all Earth based plus a couple of space stations, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, let's be honest. You look at it. Season 26 is basically Earth based. Most of in Hinchcliffe, we think of the fact that they've gone off into space and time again, but to be honest, in that second season, Planet of Evil is in space, Brain of Morbius is in space, Android Invasion in all but name is on Earth, and Pyramids of Mars is slightly in the past, and then you've got Seeds of Doom and Terror of the Zygons, which are contemporary.
Brain of Morbius, you don't need to be on an alien planet.
No, you could have done that on Earth and just set it like in the Highlands or maybe in South America or somewhere random like that. Yes, entirely true. You could do that. So really, Planet of Evil is the only one of those stories. And let's be honest, you could easily have written that so that there was a gate through to another dimension. You know, again, on the Yorkshire Moors or somewhere, you could have set that there. There's not an awful lot about Doctor Who that needs to be in space a lot of the time, and most of the producers actually set an awful lot of it on Earth anyway. So I guess I'm just saying, how might it have felt if Barry Letts had formalized that and kept the Doctor earthbound?
I mean, it wouldn't have bothered me because my favorite stories are the historical ones. My favorite stories are the Earth-based historical ones.
And we probably have had more of those.
It's weird to think also that there are no space-based historical ones because it just becomes pointless thinking about time travel in space. Like you go back to the 10th century on the planet Skaro. It's like, sometimes I don't know why that occurred to me.
Well, presumably there are
time travel stories are always earthbound.
Presumably there are lots of historical space-based ones, but we just don't distinguish them.
Yeah.
Well, kind of Genesis the Daleks is space-based historical, really.
No, what I mean, John, is the Daleks could have happened contemporaneous with an unearthly child, and we wouldn't have known. It wouldn't have.
But Genesis, you don't know when it's happening.
And an Evil of the Daleks clearly takes place eons, centuries at least, after the Daleks does, because one is supposed to be the start of their story and one is supposed to be the end of it, isn't it? And in between, they've had empires. So those are set hundreds, if not thousands of years apart. So the Daleks must be set at some point in the past.
And we need John Peel.
Well, that's certainly a note at which we ought to finish this. So we'll be back to do some more of these until such things happen. I was JR.
I was Matt.
I was Dylan.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.